Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross had been in combat zones long enough to recognize when danger wasn't just near. It was inevitable. The sun blazed over the jagged Afghan mountains, casting sharp shadows across the barren canyon floor. Dust swirled in thick, orange clouds as Ross's convoy crawled along the narrow dirt road, every rock and crevice a potential hiding spot for an enemy ambush. The air was dry, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and earth baked under relentless heat. Ross, 34, a veteran of countless operations in the Middle East, gripped his M4 tightly, scanning every cliff, every ridge, every jagged silhouette of rock. His eyes, hard and calculating, moved over his soldiers, young men mostly, many barely out of boot camp, their faces pale under the helmets. They were nervous, sweating through their fatigues. Ross didn't blame them. The canyon had a way of swallowing men whole if you weren't careful. A signal flare arced in the distance, startling a pack of ravens that screeched and took flight. Ross instinctively ducked slightly behind the armored Humvee he was riding in. The convoy moved cautiously, inching forward like soldiers in a nightmare where the walls of the canyon pressed in closer with every step. Each man's radio hissed with static, a low, constant reminder of the fragile connection to headquarters, and the frightening reality that communication could die at any moment. The first indication of danger was subtle, a fleeting shadow across the cliff above, a rock sliding unnaturally down the slope. Ross froze. The convoy slowed. Soldiers exchanged nervous glances, rifles tightening in their hands. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. An explosion rocked the lead vehicle, tossing it sideways against the canyon wall. The metal crumpled, groaning under the impact. Glass shattered, spinning like deadly snowflakes through the dust-choked air. A secondary blast followed almost immediately, sending a wave of fire toward the Humvee behind Ross. Screams erupted, mingling with the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. The canyon echoed with every sound, amplifying chaos as if nature itself conspired against them. Ross slammed himself to the ground, rolling behind a boulder that shuddered with the concussion. His ears rang, and the acrid taste of smoke and gunpowder filled his mouth. Heart hammering, he called out orders, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Return fire, keep your heads down, move to cover." But every instinct screamed that the enemy had already predicted this. Every shot they fired, every explosion, seemed meticulously planned to drive his unit into a trap. Through the cloud of smoke and the swirl of dirt, Ross could see movement along the ridges above. Shadows darted between rocks, rifles catching glints of sunlight. The enemy wasn't just firing blindly. They were calculating, aiming with lethal precision and watching him specifically. Ross recognized the pattern: trained fighters, not insurgents scrounging for a fight. They knew how to kill efficiently, how to corner prey, and how to manipulate terrain. He dove for another boulder as bullets chipped the rock beside him. Sparks flew, embedding themselves into the canyon wall. Ross's mind raced. There were only two ways out of the canyon, and both were covered. He counted his men, 5 still standing, some crouched behind vehicles, others scrambling for cover. Their faces were etched with fear, but determination burned behind their eyes. They had to survive. They had to fight. The radio crackled with intermittent static, but no clear voices came through. Ross yanked it closer, trying to force a connection. "Mayday, Mayday," Echo 2 to command. "We're pinned down in Canyon Delta. Multiple casualties. We need immediate extraction." The static hissed in response, as if mocking him. The enemy's signal jammers were at work, severing any chance of immediate support. Ross cursed under his breath. "We're on our own," he muttered, scanning the canyon. Bullets cut arcs through the dust, whipping around like angry snakes. Each shot screamed past his ears with deadly intent. He risked a glance at the lead Humvee. It was crumpled beyond recognition, flames licking the side. Smoke coiled into the sky, a thick black spiral marking the epicenter of the ambush. He counted, 3 wounded soldiers trying to drag themselves behind cover, one screaming, blood dark on his uniform. Then through the din, Ross thought he heard a voice, not over the radio but almost like a whisper on the wind. "Echo 2, I hear you." He froze, searching for the source. It wasn't one of his men. The voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably experienced. It wasn't the panicked shout of a rookie or the clipped tone of command. It was deliberate, almost ghostly in its clarity. "Who's there?" Ross shouted into the chaos. His voice was hoarse but carried authority. The bullets zipped around him, sparks flying as they struck rock and metal. The voice replied again, calm, steady. "Name, Hawk. Keep your men alive for 5 minutes and don't stand up. I'm about to start taking their world apart." Ross blinked, disbelief momentarily overwhelming him. A sniper, here, alone. He risked a glance over the boulder. Enemy fighters were still advancing, unaware of the precise, unseen death raining down on them. Every step they took, every exposure of shoulder or head was met with a sharp, precise crack. One man dropped. Another fell. The attackers faltered, confusion spreading like wildfire through their ranks. But Ross couldn't see the sniper. Not yet. The figure was a phantom, a deadly force invisible above them, in the perfect position to manipulate the battlefield. Ross pressed his back against the rock, breathing hard. Adrenaline and fear battled within him, but something about Hawk's voice inspired hope, tempered by the knowledge that the sniper wasn't invincible. He was likely alone, wounded, or stretched to the limit. If Hawk faltered, we all die. Ross's team adjusted positions, covering one another as best they could. The enemy circled, trying to flank them, unaware that unseen bullets were already thinning their numbers. Ross's heart pounded as he realized the canyon had transformed into a chessboard of life and death, with Hawk moving unseen, making every shot count. The ambush was far from over. Every ridge, every shadowed outcrop could conceal a bullet aimed at their hearts. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic scent of blood. Ross saw his men flinch, wince, and falter, but he couldn't allow fear to paralyze them. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Fight smart, fight fast." His commands rang out, carrying over the whistling of bullets and the echoing cracks of distant gunfire. Somewhere above, the canyon seemed to breathe. A boulder tumbled slightly, dust spewing downward, a warning, a signal, or perhaps just chance. Ross squinted, every nerve on edge. The enemy fighters continued to tighten their circle, moving like predators closing in on wounded prey. The canyon, he realized, had become a trap. There was no escape, not unless Hawk could hold the line. And as the sun beat down, the shadows shifted, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly across the rocks. Ross knew one brutal truth. The enemy thought they had him cornered. They thought they had the advantage. But someone up there, somewhere in the jagged rocks and burning sun, was about to change everything. And Ross had no idea just how deadly this unknown sniper would be. The canyon floor burned under the relentless Afghan sun, dust curling around jagged rocks like smoke from a funeral pyre. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross lay flat against the jagged edge of a boulder, the acrid taste of smoke and gunpowder thick on his tongue. The screams of wounded soldiers and the staccato rhythm of gunfire surrounded him, creating a chaotic symphony of death. His hands were raw, knuckles scraped from hauling a comrade behind cover moments before. Yet the fight wasn't over, not even close. He yanked his radio closer, hopping against hope that command could hear him. "Mayday, Mayday, Echo 2 to command. We're pinned down in Canyon Delta. Multiple casualties. Need immediate extraction." Static hissed back at him. Nothing more. "Damn jammers." He cursed under his breath, pressing the radio closer, shaking slightly. If they couldn't call in support, survival depended on him, his men, and whatever unforeseen miracle might intervene. His gaze swept over the remaining 5 soldiers, crouched, limping, wide-eyed with fear. Among them was Private First Class Jenkins, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, clutching his arm that had been shredded by shrapnel. His face was pale, lips trembling as he whispered prayers Ross didn't want to hear. Ross tightened his grip on his rifle. "Listen to me. You hold, you watch each other's backs, and you don't panic." His voice was firm, commanding, but even as he said it, his heart pounded like a war drum. The enemy was closing in. They had position, numbers, and a canyon that left nowhere to run. Then he heard it. A whisper in the chaos, carried faintly over the whistling bullets and groaning metal. It was too deliberate to be imagined. Echo 2, I hear you. Ross froze, scanning the cliffs, the jagged rocks, the dust-filled sky. His stomach tightened. The voice was calm, measured, trained. It carried the confidence of someone who had faced death more times than he could count. Not one of his unit, not command, someone else. Someone unseen. "Who's there?" Ross shouted, trying to pierce the fog and smoke with his voice. Another pause, then the voice again. "Name, Hawk. Keep your men alive for 5 minutes and don't stand up. I'm about to start taking their world apart." Ross blinked. A lone sniper in the chaos of an ambush promising to tip the scales. It seemed impossible. Yet, the timing of the enemy's faltering shots, the confusion creeping into their formation, it all hinted that Hawk was real. And deadly. Ross pressed his back into the rock, breath shallow. He risked a peek over the boulder. Enemy fighters were still advancing, shouting, rifles glinting in the harsh sunlight. And yet, there were bodies now, collapsing unexpectedly, a bullet from nowhere dropping a man before he could fire a shot. Is that you?" Ross whispered under his breath, incredulous. No response. Just the faintest sound of a sniper's bolt cycling somewhere high above, invisible, untouchable. Ross's adrenaline surged. Whoever Hawk was, he had changed the game. The ambush was no longer one-sided. It was a deadly ballet with a ghostly partner leading from above. Ross's mind raced. He could see enemy fighters attempting to flank the ridge, moving cautiously now, uncertain. Their confidence had been shattered by unseen bullets striking down key targets, but the canyon still felt like a cage. The enemy controlled the high ground. They were ruthless, experienced, and trained. Every misstep could mean death, not just for him, but for his men. A sharp cry split the canyon floor. One of Ross's soldiers, Corporal Diaz, had exposed his head trying to aim at an enemy sniper positioned above the ridge. A bullet cracked nearby, splintering rock inches from him. Diaz's face went white and he dropped, terrified. Ross crawled toward him, pushing him behind a jagged boulder. "Stay down," Ross hissed. "Hawk covering us." Diaz's eyes widened. Who is Hawk?" Ross shook his head. "I don't know, but he's our best shot right now." The enemy fighters regrouped, their disciplined training keeping them from panicking entirely. But confusion had set in. Some huddled behind rocks, trying to guess the source of the sniper fire. Others yelled, gesturing wildly, firing at shadows, at rocks, at empty air. Ross's team took advantage. They fired back when possible, suppressing enemy movements, but the reality was brutal. 5 soldiers against a well-prepared enemy battalion, trapped in a canyon with only one side theoretically open. Survival depended entirely on Hawk, on the phantom sniper who had arrived like an avenging shadow. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was seconds, time blurred in the canyon, compressed by terror and adrenaline. Hawk's shots continued, each one precise, each one calculated. A group of enemy fighters attempting to advance fell in quick succession, their bodies twitching as bullets tore through vital points. The canyon echoed with the sharp crack of rifles and the groans of the wounded. Ross risked another glance over the boulder. Above the chaos, he could see movement along the ridgeline, shadows flitting between rocks, cautious, desperate. But none dared expose themselves fully. Hawk's unseen rifle controlled the battlefield. Every misstep was punished. Ross's heart pounded as he realized something terrifying. The enemy wasn't giving up. They were calling in reinforcements, hand signals passing between the remaining fighters as they coordinated for a heavier assault. Rockets, machine guns, anything they could bring to bear. If Hawk couldn't hold them, the canyon would become a tomb. "Private Jenkins, cover that flank," Ross shouted, waving him toward a jagged rock formation. Jenkins obeyed, hands shaking violently but following orders. Ross's eyes flicked over the cliffside, searching for any sign of Hawk. Nothing. Not a glint of metal, not a silhouette. Only the occasional whisper of a spent bullet and the distant, precise thwack of impact as another enemy fighter dropped. The sound of a vehicle engine rumbled in the distance, an enemy truck approaching from the far end of the canyon. Ross's stomach twisted. Reinforcements. The enemy was attempting to seal them in completely. He turned to his team, scanning their pale, dirt-smeared faces. "Listen to me," he barked, tone sharpened by fear and urgency. "We hold, we survive. Hawk's up there, covering us, but if he goes down, it's all over." He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, a suffocating certainty that every second mattered. Every decision, every movement could determine who would live and who would die. Sweat streaked his face, mingling with dust and blood, stinging his eyes. A sudden crack echoed above, a high-pitched, terrifyingly precise shot. One of the enemy fighters attempting to fire a rocket launcher fell, twisting violently as a single bullet ended him before he could aim. Ross's heart leapt. Hawk had just turned the tide again. The enemy froze, their advance faltering under the unseen assault. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Some shouted in frustration, gesturing wildly, but Hawk's intervention had thrown them into chaos. For the first time, Ross felt a spark of hope. But the relief was short-lived. Another shadow moved along the cliff, more fighters attempting to flank, trying to get the sniper. Hawk's presence was no longer a guarantee. The battle was far from over, and danger pressed in from every angle. Ross pressed himself further against the rock, scanning, calculating. Every movement mattered. Every shot mattered. And somewhere above, Hawk watched, calculated, and fired. The canyon had become a crucible of chaos, smoke, and dust, a battlefield of unseen forces. Ross knew, in that suspended moment of terror, that survival hinged on one man he had never met. A man called Hawk. And Hawk had only promised 5 minutes. Ross's mind raced. 5 minutes was almost impossible, almost deadly, but there was no choice. They had to hold, survive, and trust a ghost. The enemy adjusted, signaling to someone farther up the ridge, probably calling for heavier weapons. Rockets, machine guns, traps within traps. Ross gritted his teeth. Sweat and dust streaked across his face. He looked at his team, every one of them alive but battered. 5 minutes, he whispered under his breath. We survive 5 minutes. And in the chaos of the canyon, with bullets slicing the air, smoke choking the sun, and enemy fighters closing in, Ross understood one terrifying truth. The fight was only beginning. Hawk was out there, somewhere unseen, carrying the impossible burden of turning a certain death into survival. And if Hawk failed, they all would die. The dust had barely settled when the first shot rang out. It was not from Ross or his men, nor from the advancing enemy. It was precise, almost surgical, cutting through the chaos with a deadly clarity. A fighter who had been confidently signaling orders to his team suddenly jerked, his body collapsing to the ground. A single bullet had found its mark with terrifying accuracy. Ross froze, adrenaline spiking. The shot had come from nowhere, or so it seemed. He risked a glance upward, but the cliffside was jagged, shadows slicing the sun into fragmented beams. There was no glint of metal, no hint of a figure. Only the occasional shifting of rocks, dust tumbling down the canyon walls. Another shot cracked through the canyon. Another fighter went down. Then a third. The enemy froze, confusion rippling through their ranks like wildfire. They had trained for ambushes, for chaos, for surprise. But this was different. Unseen, unstoppable, deadly. Ross's hand went instinctively to his radio. "Hawk, if that's you, you're a miracle right now. Who the hell are you?" "Doesn't matter," came the calm reply, almost a whisper above the chaos. "Keep your men alive. Don't stand up. Watch and learn." Ross blinked, stunned. That voice, calm, measured, ice-cold, was a lifeline in the canyon of chaos. He pressed himself flatter against the boulder, his men following his lead. The enemy, once confident, now hesitated, scanning shadows, unsure where the bullets were coming from. Ross counted, 3 fighters down. More were retreating behind rocks, ducking for cover, yelling incomprehensible orders. But some of them were still moving forward, desperate to trap his squad to finish the ambush. The air smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. Smoke from the burning Humvees hung in thick, black coils. Every breath tasted metallic. Then Ross saw it, a shadow flickering along a ridge above. Just for a second. Could it have been Hawk, or a trick of the dust? Impossible to tell. He ducked immediately, keeping his team low, but that instant glimpse was enough to instill a mix of hope and fear. The sniper existed and was real and deadly. The enemy regrouped, though their movements were frantic and disorganized. One fighter lifted a rocket launcher, aiming at the pinned-down squad. Another tried to flank the left, desperate to find the sniper's location. Ross's team froze, unsure which threat to neutralize first. "Hold your fire," Ross hissed. "Let Hawk handle them." And Hawk did. Another shot, precise, loud, final. The rocket gunner dropped, the weapon skidding across the rock-strewn ground. Another fighter exposed his shoulder and was gone before he could react. Every shot from above seemed impossible, a ghostly force dismantling the enemy in perfect rhythm. Ross felt a flicker of awe, tempered by the deadly stakes. The enemy wasn't just being suppressed, they were being eliminated. And yet, the canyon was far from safe. The remaining fighters were adapting, signaling frantically to one another, attempting to locate the sniper and regain control. "Cover the right flank," Ross shouted, moving quickly to push his wounded soldiers into better positions behind rocks and debris. He risked glancing over the boulder again. Shadows moved along the ridgeline, small, deliberate, calculating. Hawk was making the cliffs his weapon, turning the terrain itself against the enemy. But Ross's moment of relief ended abruptly. From the opposite side of the canyon, a new threat emerged, a heavy machine gun emplacement, a Soviet PKM mounted on a tripod, now coming into position. 3 enemy fighters hauled belts of ammunition, their movements efficient and terrifyingly coordinated. Ross's stomach clenched. The PKM could shred his squad in seconds. "Hawk," Ross hissed into the radio. "PKM on the ridge, 3 men. They're lining up on us." "I see them," came the calm reply. "Watch this." Another shot cracked from above. One of the PKM operators jerked violently, his rifle arm collapsing to the side. Sparks flew as another round found its mark in the second operator. Ross's eyes widened as he realized what Hawk was doing. He wasn't just killing. He was neutralizing the most immediate threats with surgical precision. The third gunner lifted his head, scanning for the sniper. Another shot hit, perfectly timed, and he dropped, slumping into the rocks. The PKM went silent, the barrel smoking. Ross couldn't believe it. One man, unseen, had dismantled the enemy's most powerful weapon in the canyon. But the relief was fleeting. From the shadows of the far ridgeline, more fighters were signaling, regrouping. Rockets, explosives, heavier reinforcements. They were not done. They would attempt to bring the canyon down on Ross's squad. The enemy's desperation was growing, making them more dangerous than ever. Ross pressed himself lower. His hands shook as he checked his team. Private Jenkins' arm was bleeding through the torn sleeve. Corporal Diaz's leg was splintered, his face twisted in pain and fear. Yet they moved when Ross directed them, clinging to life with determination that bordered on heroism. Above them, Hawk continued his deadly work, voice calm and almost conversational over the radio. "Move when I tell you. Don't show yourself, trust me." Every shot from Hawk was a lesson in precision. Rocks, crates, and even dust clouds became weapons, directing enemy attention away from Ross's team, forcing misfires and confusion. The enemy was caught between 2 forces, the natural danger of the canyon and the supernatural precision of the sniper above. Ross risked a glance upward again, spotting a small trail of dust that might have been Hawk moving, shifting position. A faint line of blood streaked the rock. The sniper was injured. That calm, almost invincible voice carried through the radio, but Ross knew instinctively that Hawk was fighting, every second, every heartbeat, through pain. He cursed under his breath. If Hawk went down, they all went down. The canyon offered no mercy, and the enemy knew it. Suddenly, a rocket shrieked overhead, arcing through the canyon. Ross dove, dragging Private Jenkins behind cover. The explosion rocked the ground, hurling dirt and small rocks into the air. Smoke filled their lungs, stinging, choking. Another rocket followed, another near miss, shaking the canyon walls. Hawk's shots continued, each one deflecting enemy fire, creating confusion, forcing the rockets off course. Ross realized something horrifying and incredible at the same time. Hawk was not just fighting the enemy, he was controlling the battlefield. Every shot, every misfire by the enemy, every hesitation, it was because of Hawk. Ross's chest heaved. Sweat, blood, and dust streaked his face. He looked at his team. They were exhausted, terrified, and wounded, but alive. Against impossible odds, they were surviving because of Hawk. And yet the enemy was still coming. A squad of fighters broke off from the main group, moving deliberately toward a flank, clearly hunting for the sniper above. Ross's stomach dropped. They had realized the true threat, the unseen sharpshooter controlling their fate. If Hawk fell, the ambush would tighten, and death would descend on Ross and his men. He pressed his back to the rock, gripping his rifle, praying silently that Hawk could hold. That one man, perched high in the jagged rocks, unseen and unbroken, could continue to defy the impossible. And in that moment, Ross understood the terrifying truth. The enemy was still in control, still desperate, still dangerous. But Hawk was no ordinary soldier. He was a force of nature, a ghost in the canyon, and a lifeline for Ross and his men. For the first time since the ambush began, Ross allowed himself a brief, fleeting hope. But the moment was fragile. The enemy was already signaling for heavier weapons, coordinating from farther back, desperate to reclaim control. The canyon still smelled of smoke, blood, and gunpowder, and the danger was far from over. Ross whispered to his team, barely audible, "We survive, just survive, Hawk's out there." And somewhere above, in the jagged rocks and dust, Hawk continued to watch, calculate, and fire, an unseen sentinel against certain death. The canyon had become a deadly game of shadows and bullets, and survival hung by a thread. Ross's pulse raced, every nerve on fire. The fight was escalating. Hawk was proving to be the difference between life and death. But how long could one man hold back an army? The answer would come soon, in bullets, blood, and dust. And Ross knew it. The air in the canyon was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross pressed himself against the jagged rocks, chest heaving as the acrid residue of gunfire clung to his skin. The heat of the sun was unrelenting, baking the dust into a gritty paste on his face and hands. His men were scattered behind boulders, each one wounded, shaking, or coughing, but still alive. All alive because of Hawk. For a fleeting moment, Ross allowed himself to hope. Hawk's precision had already claimed several key enemy fighters, disrupting the ambush and buying precious time. But that fragile relief was ripped away when he saw it. A glint of metal far above, a monstrous silhouette rising against the sun. A Soviet PKM machine gun, mounted on a tripod, hauled by 3 enemy fighters. Its barrel gleamed with deadly promise, aimed with deliberate care directly at the exposed squad below. The roar of this weapon could shred human flesh faster than any sniper round. Ross's stomach dropped. "They've got a PKM," he hissed into the radio, voice taut with urgency. 3 men, mounted and ready to fire. If that thing opens up, we're dead. Static answered, then the faint, calm reply. "I see them, don't move." Ross's heart skipped a beat. Calm, too calm, that was Hawk. The sniper was watching, calculating, preparing. The 3 PKM operators worked with terrifying precision, loading belts of ammunition, adjusting the barrel, coordinating to unleash maximum destruction. Ross knew the weapon's potential. If it fired even a single burst, the bullets could tear through the squad's makeshift cover like paper. He crouched lower, pushing Private Jenkins flat against the dust. Corporal Diaz winced, his broken leg pressed against the jagged rock. Ross's mind raced. Every second mattered. One wrong movement, one flinch, one exposure, and the PKM would rain death across the canyon. Then he heard it, the unmistakable crack of a sniper round. One of the PKM operators jerked violently, his head snapping back. Sparks flew where the bullet struck metal. The second operator twisted, trying to see the shooter, but another shot ended him instantly. The third man froze, fear written across his face, and tried to reposition, only to be cut down by a third, perfectly timed shot. Ross's jaw dropped. Hawk had dismantled the PKM before it even had a chance to fire. One sniper, unseen, had neutralized the enemy's most lethal weapon in the canyon. But the enemy wasn't done. From the far side of the canyon, more fighters began signaling frantically, coordinating reinforcements. Rockets, grenades, heavier weapons. They were desperate. And desperation made enemies unpredictable, dangerous. Ross knew the battle was far from over. "Hawk," he whispered into the radio. "They're calling in reinforcements, RPGs, rockets, anything they can grab. Can you handle it?" "I can make them miss," came the calm reply. "Stay low, keep moving when I say, don't stand up." Ross glanced at his men. Fear and exhaustion were etched into every line of their faces, but determination burned behind their eyes. They trusted him, and he trusted Hawk, but the weight of responsibility pressed on him like a boulder. If Hawk faltered, all of them would die. The first RPG screamed through the canyon, a streak of fire against the dusty sky. Ross lunged, pushing Jenkins behind a boulder as the explosion tore up rocks and sand around them. The shockwave slammed into their bodies, knocking them to the ground. Dust and debris choked the air, stinging their eyes and throat. Hawk's shots came again, precise, lethal, surgical. The sniper was not just killing enemies, he was manipulating the battlefield. He fired at rocks, at crates, at objects near the enemy, redirecting their attention, throwing their aim off, causing rockets to veer wide. Each shot created chaos, misdirection, and opportunity for Ross's team to survive. Ross risked a glance over the boulder. Sparks of metal flew from the rocks above, and an enemy fighter tumbled violently down the slope. Another shot struck near a machine gun emplacement farther up the canyon, forcing its operators to duck. Hawk was everywhere and nowhere, an unseen sentinel controlling the chaos with unerring skill. But the PKM had been just the beginning. From the shadows of the cliffs, more enemy fighters emerged, their movements coordinated, their aim deadly. Rockets whistled overhead, some landing dangerously close, spraying rock and debris. Ross felt the sting of shrapnel against his arms and face. "Move," he shouted, directing his team toward safer boulders. Every step was a risk. Every breath could be their last. But Hawk's presence gave them the chance, an almost supernatural edge against overwhelming odds. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity. Every sound, bullet, shout, explosion, echoed with lethal consequence. Ross's eyes darted across the canyon, scanning every ridge, every shadow, every potential threat. The enemy was adapting, trying to locate Hawk, trying to neutralize the unseen force controlling their every move. Another RPG streaked through the air. Ross dove behind a boulder, hearing the impact explode behind them. Dust filled his lungs. Blood ran down his arms from minor shrapnel cuts. His men groaned in pain, but they moved when he directed them, following every command with grim determination. "Hawk," Ross shouted over the chaos, voice cracking. "They're advancing, more rockets, more fire. You need to stop them." A calm reply. "They'll learn to miss if I have to. Keep your heads down. Watch the flash, watch the smoke. Move when I say." Ross felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Hawk wasn't invincible. He was human, even if he sounded like a ghost. Blood streaked along a rock above. The sniper was injured, forcing shots through pain and exhaustion. Ross realized the gravity of their situation. They had survived so far, but every second stretched the limit of endurance for everyone involved. The enemy began adjusting, signaling to additional forces farther up the ridges. More rockets, more explosives, more reinforcements. Their desperation grew. Ross's hands shook as he loaded another magazine, sweat and dust coating his fingers. Then a strange, almost terrifying thing happened. Enemy fighters began shooting at shadows, rocks, and dust clouds rather than Ross's team. Hawk's intervention had turned their strength against them. Every misstep, every flinch, every wasted bullet was a testament to his precision. The sniper wasn't just surviving, he was controlling the battlefield. Ross risked a glance upward again. The faint trail of blood was more visible now. Hawk was injured, wounded by some earlier shot, yet still firing, still controlling the chaos. He was a phantom of skill, pain, and relentless focus, and Ross realized the grim truth. If Hawk fell, they were all dead. And then the sound of footsteps, deliberate and organized, reached Ross's ears. Shadows moved along the upper ridges. Enemy reinforcements closing in on the sniper's position. Hawk's voice, calm but strained, cut through the static. "They're coming for me, don't move." Ross's stomach clenched. He knew the canyon wasn't just a trap for his squad anymore, it was a trap for Hawk as well. One man, wounded, perched on a cliff fighting death itself while keeping an entire squad alive below. The stakes had never been higher. The enemy fired blindly, desperate to locate Hawk. Rockets were launched, rifles sprayed bullets into dust clouds. The canyon echoed with chaos, death, and smoke. Ross's team huddled, pinned down, barely breathing, barely surviving. And above it all, Hawk's sniper rounds continued to crack, precise and lethal, unseen yet omnipresent, reshaping the battlefield one bullet at a time. Ross pressed himself flat against the rock, trying to control his shaking hands. "Hold on," he whispered to Jenkins and Diaz. "We survive. Hawk's holding the line." The PKM was destroyed, rockets were deflected, and the enemy was in chaos. But Ross knew the fight was far from over. They had survived the first wave, but the canyon was still alive with danger. Every second stretched thin with tension, every heartbeat a countdown toward either survival or death. And Hawk was wounded, fighting through pain, unseen, unstoppable, and the last line of defense between life and annihilation. The canyon had become a crucible of chaos, dust, blood, and bullets, and the outcome rested entirely on the precision, courage, and unseen hand of one man. Ross knew it, and the enemy knew it. The machine gun had awakened, but Hawk was already rewriting the rules. The canyon had become a living nightmare. Dust swirled in choking clouds, mingling with smoke from burning Humvees, and the smell of scorched earth and gunpowder filled every inhalation. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross's muscles screamed in protest as he crouched behind a jagged boulder, sweat and grime streaking his face. Around him, his men trembled, bloodied but alive, gripping rifles that felt suddenly too heavy for exhausted arms. Rockets screamed through the canyon like angry comets, each one a potential death sentence. The enemy was relentless, firing blindly, spraying the rocks with lethal intent. One streak of fire slammed into a boulder near Private Jenkins, sending shards of stone into the air. Jenkins yelped, pressing himself flatter into the dust, trying to stay alive. Ross's own heart pounded against his ribs. "Hawk," he shouted into the radio, voice hoarse, dust choking every word. "Rockets coming in from the east ridge. If they hit us, we're done." A calm, deliberate voice returned. "I see them. Wait for my mark. Don't move until I tell you." Ross's jaw tightened. Hawk, perched somewhere high on the cliffs, was wounded. Blood streaked the rocks near the sniper's last known position. Every shot must be calculated, precise, each one a gamble against a deadly machine. And yet Hawk's confidence, icy, unnerving, radiated through the radio like a tether to survival. Ross risked a glance over the boulder. A rocket streaked past, hitting rocks just a few feet from Diaz's broken leg. The blast hurled dust and gravel into the canyon floor, sending shrapnel flying. Diaz groaned, gritting his teeth. Ross pushed him flat against the ground, hands shaking, fingers scraped from the jagged rock. The enemy was advancing with brutal coordination. A squad of fighters had split off, creeping along the east ridge, launching rockets, firing sporadically and trying to locate Hawk. Ross's pulse raced. The canyon walls amplified every sound. Explosions echoed, bullets cracked, and distant shouts carried across the jagged rocks with terrifying clarity. "Move," Ross hissed to his men, motioning toward a slightly lower boulder that offered marginally better cover. Each movement was a gamble. A single misstep could spell death. The canyon had become a deadly chessboard, and Ross had no idea which pieces would survive the next move. Hawk's shots rang out, sharp and precise. One fighter attempting to reload a rocket launcher tumbled violently down the slope. Another froze mid-step, twisting as a single round from nowhere ended his life before he could fire. Ross's eyes widened. Hawk was not just surviving. He was controlling the battlefield, turning desperation into chaos for the enemy. Yet the threat was escalating. More rockets screamed toward Ross's position, some narrowly missing, others exploding near boulders, hurling fragments and dust. Each blast was a reminder of the canyon's merciless nature. Survival was no longer a question of courage alone. It was a matter of precision, timing, and sheer luck. Ross crawled to Jenkins, helping him shift closer to safer cover. "Stay low. Don't move unless I say," he hissed. Jenkins nodded, wide-eyed, gripping his rifle like a lifeline. Ross's eyes scanned the ridge. Shadows flitted across rocks, and he could see the faint glint of rifles and movement, enemy fighters searching for Hawk, unaware that one wounded sniper was already orchestrating their defeat. "Fire when ready," Hawk's voice cut through the chaos. Ross felt a shiver of relief. The calm, measured voice seemed to freeze the enemy in place. Rockets continued to streak across the canyon, but Hawk's sniper rounds deflected, neutralized, or distracted the enemy. Each shot was a masterclass in battlefield control, bullets hitting rocks near enemy feet, striking weapons and forcing misfires. The canyon floor became a tableau of chaos. Boulders, blood, dust, smoke, and flying rock fragments created a surreal, nightmarish scene. Ross's men huddled, wounded but alive, hearts hammering as explosions erupted around them. Every breath tasted of grit and fear, yet they continued to cling to life, following every command, trusting the unseen sniper above. Then came the sharp sound of metal scraping stone. Ross's eyes darted upward. Enemy fighters were attempting to climb the cliffs to reach Hawk's position. The sniper had already neutralized key threats, but the canyon's terrain gave the enemy a dangerous advantage if they moved quickly. Ross gritted his teeth. "Hawk, they're climbing," he shouted, "if they reach you." "Not a chance," Hawk interrupted, calm, cold, calculating. "Keep low, watch the flash, watch the smoke, move only when I say." Ross risked another glance over the boulder. A faint outline, barely visible, shifted along the ridge, Hawk moving, adjusting, blood streaking the rocks nearby. The sniper was wounded but undeterred, firing precise rounds that felled the climbers before they could gain purchase. Sparks flew as bullets struck rocks, and bodies tumbled down the slope like rag dolls. Rockets continued to streak through the canyon, some exploding dangerously close, others narrowly missing. Every explosion sent waves of debris and dust into the air, momentarily blinding Ross and his team. Yet Hawk's intervention kept them alive. The sniper was a phantom, unseen, operating with a lethal calm that belied the chaos around him. Ross's hands shook as he reloaded his rifle, counting the seconds, calculating the next move. The canyon had become a battlefield of shadows and dust, bullets and blood, and survival hung by the thinnest thread. His men were battered, bleeding, exhausted, yet they remained alive. Hawk was the difference. the unseen guardian holding the line against overwhelming odds. Another streak of fire arced across the sky, a rocket narrowly missing their position. Ross dove behind a boulder, coughing, feeling the sting of dirt and debris against his skin. Jenkins whimpered, pressing his face into the dust. Diaz groaned, shifting painfully on his broken leg. Ross felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than the sun overhead. Every second, every movement mattered. One misstep, one failed command, one bullet. It could all be over. Hawk's voice returned, calm but firm. "Now move left fast, low." Ross barked orders, dragging Jenkins and Diaz behind a slightly larger boulder that offered marginally better cover. Each step was a gamble. Rockets screamed overhead, bullets cracked dangerously close, but they moved, following Hawk's instructions like a lifeline. The sniper's precision continued to control the battlefield. Every shot disrupted the enemy, every missed rocket highlighted their desperation. The canyon became a living, breathing crucible of chaos, Hawk the ghostly hand guiding survival through precision and courage. Ross risked a glance upward once more. A faint trail of blood streaked the rocks, confirming Hawk's injury. Yet the sniper's calm, deliberate shots continued to fell enemies, one after another, turning desperation into chaos for those who believed they had the upper hand. And then, a rocket landed just a few feet from their position, hurling dust and debris into the air. Ross pressed his face into the rock, heart hammering, praying silently that Hawk would survive this next wave. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. The enemy was in disarray, some retreating, some still firing blindly, but all uncertain, all vulnerable to Hawk's unseen precision. Ross's squad remained pinned, battered, but alive. And above it all, Hawk's sniper rounds continued to crack, precise, lethal, and seemingly impossible to stop. Ross's pulse raced. The fight was far from over. The rockets, the reinforcements, the sheer chaos of the canyon, all threatened to overwhelm them. Yet Hawk's skill, bravery, and relentless precision kept them alive. Ross pressed himself against the rock, whispering to his men, "Stay alive. Hawk's holding the line, just stay alive." The canyon roared around them, dust, rockets, bullets, and the cries of the dying, but survival hung by a thread. Hawk's unseen hand was the difference between life and annihilation. And Ross knew it. The canyon was a furnace of chaos. Dust swirled in thick clouds, stinging the eyes and lungs of Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross and his men. Smoke from burning Humvees drifted across the rocky canyon floor, mingling with the scent of gunpowder and sweat. The roar of rockets and automatic fire echoed off the jagged cliffs, turning the narrow canyon into a deadly amphitheater. Every heartbeat was a countdown, every breath a gamble. Ross crouched behind a jagged boulder, chest heaving. His hands were scraped and bleeding from the rocks, his uniform darkened with grime and sweat. Around him, his men were battered, coughing, trembling, but alive. All alive for now because of Hawk. But Hawk was wounded. Ross had seen the faint streak of blood along the ridge above, a thin line in the dust where the sniper had been injured. The realization struck him like a physical blow. One man, injured, perched high in the jagged rocks, was the difference between survival and death. "Rockets coming in," Jenkins shouted, pointing toward a plume of smoke rising from the enemy's far ridge. The first streak screamed across the canyon, followed by another. Ross dove with his men behind cover as the explosions hurled rock and dust into the air. "Hawk," Ross hissed into the radio, voice cracking with urgency. "They're raining rockets, if they hit us." "Not if I can help it," came the calm, controlled reply. "Stay down, follow my lead, watch the flashes, move when I tell you." Ross's pulse surged. Hawk's voice was ice cold, almost unnatural in its steadiness, yet it radiated hope in a canyon that offered little. Ross pressed himself lower, scanning every ridge, every shadow. Enemy fighters were still moving, desperate and adaptive, trying to locate the sniper who had dismantled their PKM and neutralized multiple squads. Another explosion shook the ground nearby. Ross felt the sting of debris and grit against his arms. He pushed Jenkins closer behind a jagged boulder. Diaz groaned, adjusting his weight on his broken leg. Ross's eyes flicked across the canyon, calculating every move, knowing that survival hinged on precision, on Hawk, on timing, on a single man's will. Then came a crack from above, a sniper round. One of the advancing fighters jerking into position for a rocket launcher tumbled violently down the slope, his body hitting the jagged rocks with a sickening thud. Another shot struck near a cluster of enemy fighters, causing sparks to fly from rock surfaces and forcing a misfire. Hawk was still alive. Hawk was still lethal. But the canyon demanded more than defense. The enemy was relentless, their desperation driving them to innovate, adapt, and attack harder. Ross realized the only way to survive was not just to hold, but to strike back strategically, and Hawk was the key. "Hawk," Ross whispered into the radio, voice low and urgent. "You're our only shot. Can you turn this around?" "I plan to," came the calm reply. "But I need a distraction. Move your men slightly left, follow the debris, and stay low. Trust me." Ross nodded even though Hawk couldn't see him. He signaled his team, motioning carefully. "Left, slow, behind the boulders, follow the dust. Don't expose yourselves." The men moved, crawling behind rocks, hearts hammering. Rockets screamed past, some narrowly missing, others exploding near boulders and hurling stone fragments into the air. Hawk's timing was perfect. Every step Ross's men took was covered, every misfire by the enemy exploited. And then Hawk made the move. A single shot rang out ping, and an enemy fighter froze mid-step. Another ping, and a rocket operator tumbled down the ridge. Hawk's aim was surgical, precise, almost supernatural. He was creating a narrow window for Ross and his team to reposition, forcing the enemy into predictable patterns. Ross felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Hawk was wounded, yet still controlling the battlefield. Every shot dictated the enemy's actions, and every misstep was exploited to keep his men alive. Then came the audacious gamble. Ross saw a shadow move along the ridge, a single, deliberate figure adjusting position. Hawk was climbing higher, risking exposure to take a new vantage point. The enemy had caught sight of movement and began firing in a panic, spraying bullets at the ridge. "Move when I say," Hawk's voice cut through the radio, calm but firm. Ross's men stayed low, bodies pressed into the dust, hearts hammering. The enemy's bullets ricocheted off rocks, scattering debris. One round thudded near Diaz, sending a jagged rock fragment into his shoulder. He cried out, and Ross pressed a hand against the wound, murmuring for him to stay down. Above them, Hawk continued his ascent. His shots were still precise, felling climbers, neutralizing rocket launchers, and forcing the enemy to scatter. Each movement was a dance of death, a calculated gamble against overwhelming odds. Ross risked another glance over the boulder. Sparks flew from rocks as bullets struck metal. Enemy fighters were dropping, misfiring, retreating, but more were climbing, desperate, adaptive. Hawk was wounded, but his resolve was unwavering. Every shot, every movement, every breath was a lifeline for the squad below. Then the moment came. Hawk exposed himself slightly, aiming at the lead enemy fighter coordinating the remaining rocket squads. One shot, ping, and the enemy leader collapsed. Confusion spread like wildfire. Rockets faltered mid-flight, weapons jammed, and the enemy's coordination shattered. Hawk had gambled and won. Ross's chest heaved, sweat and grime streaking his face. His men were still alive. They had survived another wave. But the canyon was far from safe. The enemy was regrouping, signaling reinforcements from a distant ridge. More rockets, more fighters, more chaos. The battle was far from over. "Hawk, are you okay?" Ross whispered into the radio, voice strained. "I'll manage," came the reply, almost casual despite the obvious blood streaks along the ridge. "Just keep moving, follow my lead, watch the flash, watch the smoke." Ross's mind raced. Hawk was wounded, controlling the battlefield with precision that seemed impossible for a single man. The canyon floor was littered with dust, debris, and bodies. Every step forward was a gamble. Every misfire could spell disaster. But Hawk had bought them time, precious, fleeting time, and Ross knew that without him they wouldn't have survived this long. The enemy fired rockets indiscriminately, but Hawk's sniper rounds continued to find their marks, disrupting, deflecting, and dismantling the attacks. The canyon became a living battlefield of dust, smoke, bullets, and death, and Hawk was the unseen force orchestrating survival. Ross pressed himself against the boulder, heart hammering. "Stay alive," he whispered to his men. "Hawk's holding the line, just stay alive." The canyon roared around them. Rockets screamed, bullets cracked, dust clouds erupted, and the enemy adapted desperately. But Hawk's unseen hand dictated the rhythm of survival. Ross knew the gamble Hawk had taken, exposing himself to take a decisive vantage point, had turned the tide. But the sniper was wounded, the enemy was relentless, and every second stretched the limits of endurance. The fight was escalating toward its climax, and survival depended on precision, courage, and a single unseen man, Hawk. And Ross knew it. The canyon held its breath, waiting for the next move. The canyon had become a furnace of chaos and death. Dust swirled like ghosts across the jagged rocks, the air thick with smoke from burning Humvees. Rockets screamed overhead, exploding in clouds of debris that shook the canyon floor. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross pressed himself flat against a jagged boulder, muscles screaming, lungs burning with every inhale. Around him, his men huddled, battered, bloodied, but alive. For now. Every heartbeat was a countdown, every breath a gamble, every second spent exposed could be the last. And yet, the one thread holding them together, the invisible line between survival and death, was Hawk. Hawk, the wounded, unseen sniper perched somewhere above, orchestrating chaos with surgical precision. His earlier maneuver, climbing higher along the cliffside to gain a decisive vantage point, had turned the tide. The enemy was in disarray, rockets misfiring, coordination shattered, but the fight was far from over. Ross risked a glance over the boulder. The enemy was still moving, frantic, desperate, trying to locate Hawk. Their rockets screamed past, exploding into dust clouds, hurling fragments of stone and metal across the canyon floor. Ross ducked, feeling the sting of debris across his arms and face. Jenkins whimpered behind him, pressing himself into the dirt, while Diaz shifted painfully on his broken leg. "Hawk," Ross hissed into the radio. "They're regrouping, reinforcements coming from the West Ridge. We're trapped." "I know," came the calm reply. "Time to finish this. Follow my lead, stay low until I give the signal." Ross's chest tightened. Hawk's voice was calm, almost too calm for the chaos surrounding them. Yet it radiated confidence, an unshakable certainty that survival was possible if they followed instructions perfectly. The enemy fighters, desperate to regain control, advanced in small, coordinated waves. Rockets streaked through the canyon like deadly serpents, rifles spat fire, and the echoes of shouts and screams ricocheted off the jagged cliffs. Every step forward was a calculated gamble. Ross's men had learned to move only when Hawk gave the mark, each maneuver choreographed to maximize survival. Then came the signal. "Move now," Hawk's voice cut through the chaos. Ross barked orders, dragging his men behind boulders toward a slightly lower ridge that offered better cover. Every motion was calculated, every flinch could mean death. Rockets screamed past, some exploding dangerously close, but Hawk's precision kept the enemy off balance. Shots rang out from above, dropping attackers before they could gain ground. Ross risked a glance upward. Hawk's figure, faint and bloodied against the cliffside, was moving methodically. Each step was a gamble, each shot calculated to perfection. Sparks flew from rocks as enemy bullets struck, but Hawk pressed forward, taking the fight to the enemy rather than waiting passively. One of the enemy's rocket operators exposed himself to fire. Hawk's round struck with deadly accuracy. The man tumbled violently down the slope, his weapon skidding across the rocks. Another fighter tried to flank Ross's position. Another round, and he collapsed before he could take aim. Ross's pulse raced. Hawk was wounded, exposed, yet he was turning the tide decisively. The canyon had shifted from a trap into a battlefield where the unseen sniper dictated the enemy's every move. But the enemy was not finished. From the far west ridge, reinforcements poured in, more fighters, more rockets, more weapons. Their desperation grew, their movements reckless but coordinated. They had realized the threat, the sniper controlling their every action. Hawk had become their target, and their vengeance was deadly. Ross pressed himself against the boulder, chest heaving, eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. Rockets whistled past, explosions shaking the ground, sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. Jenkins and Diaz were trembling but alive. Survival depended entirely on Hawk's continued precision. The sniper made another bold move. He repositioned higher, exposing himself to a new angle that covered the west ridge. Enemy fighters noticed, spraying bullets toward the ridge, but Hawk fired with unerring accuracy. One man fell mid-step, another froze and dropped his rocket launcher, a third tumbled down the slope. Chaos erupted among the attackers. Ross's men seized the moment, moving to safer boulders, reloading and preparing for any opportunity Hawk created. The canyon floor became a battlefield of dust, rocks, and blood, but for the first time since the ambush began, Ross felt a surge of hope. "Hawk, you've got them disoriented," Ross said into the radio, voice taut with adrenaline. "But more are coming. They're coordinating." "I see them," Hawk replied, calm, measured, almost detached. "Time to end this. Follow my mark and stay alive." Then it happened. The sniper took a daring shot at a cluster of enemy fighters coordinating rocket fire. The impact was devastating. One rocket misfired, rolling harmlessly down the slope. Another hit a boulder, exploding and throwing the remaining fighters into disarray. Hawk's positioning was perfect, a combination of risk and lethal precision that left the enemy scrambling. Ross watched in disbelief. One man, wounded, bloodied, perched on a cliff, was controlling an entire canyon, dictating survival with a single rifle. The enemy, once confident, was now desperate, scattered, and terrified. But Hawk wasn't done. He shifted again, taking aim at the lead enemy commander, coordinating reinforcements. One shot, ping, and the commander collapsed. The chain of command broke instantly. Rockets faltered, soldiers hesitated, and the momentum swung irreversibly. Ross's chest heaved, sweat and dust streaking his face. His team was still alive, his men battered but breathing. The tide of the canyon battle had shifted. Hawk had turned what seemed like certain death into a fighting chance. Yet danger still lurked. The canyon was littered with rocks, debris, and wounded fighters. Rockets still screamed overhead. Enemy reinforcements were regrouping farther back, preparing for another wave. Hawk was wounded, exposed, and every second of continued survival was a miracle. Ross pressed his back into the rock, whispering to Jenkins and Diaz, "Stay alive. Hawk's holding them off. We survive, just stay alive." The sniper continued to fire, each shot dismantling enemy coordination, forcing misfires and creating openings. The canyon had become a chessboard, and Hawk was the unseen master, manipulating the enemy's every move with surgical precision. And then the moment came. Hawk's round struck the last group of rocket operators attempting to fire at Ross's position. The rockets tumbled harmlessly down the canyon, misfired, or exploded against rocks. The remaining enemy fighters froze, confusion and fear rippling through their ranks. Ross's pulse raced. Hawk had done it. Against impossible odds, the sniper had shifted the tide of the battle. The enemy was disoriented, scattered, and no longer able to coordinate attacks effectively. Survival was no longer just a hope, it was a possibility. Ross allowed himself a fleeting moment of relief, though adrenaline still coursed through his veins. Hawk, wounded and unseen, had orchestrated a near-impossible victory. The canyon, once a trap, was now a controlled battlefield under the influence of one extraordinary man. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Ross knew the fight was not over. Hawk was injured, the enemy still loomed, and the canyon held untold dangers. Every second was still a battle, every breath a gamble. And in that crucible of dust, rockets, and blood, one truth remained clear. Hawk was more than a sniper. He was a phantom, a guardian, and the difference between life and death. The tide had turned, but the canyon had not yet surrendered its secrets. The canyon fell into a tense, uneasy silence. Dust hung thick in the air, clinging to every surface, every uniform, every breath. The roar of rockets and gunfire had faded, replaced by the occasional crack of a distant rifle and the low moan of wounded fighters scattered across the jagged rocks. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ross pressed himself against a boulder, chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking his face. Around him, his men, Jenkins, Diaz, and the rest of the squad, huddled, battered but alive. For the first time in hours, Ross allowed himself to look around. The battlefield was a landscape of chaos. Smoking Humvees, shattered rocks, the bodies of enemy fighters strewn across the canyon floor. But survival hung in fragile balance because Hawk, the lone sniper, was wounded. Blood streaked the rocks near his position, a faint trail left from his perilous climb. He had been perched high along the cliffs, unseen yet omnipresent, orchestrating every shot, every misfire, every moment of survival. Ross swallowed hard, heart pounding. "Hawk," he whispered into the radio, voice trembling, we made it this far. Are you okay?" A faint crackle, then the calm, steady voice unmistakable. "I'll manage, just keep your heads down. Don't move until I tell you." Ross pressed himself lower, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The enemy had been disoriented, scattered, and shaken by Hawk's precision. Rockets had misfired, reinforcements faltered, and the once confident attackers had been reduced to panicked, scrambling shadows. But the canyon still held danger. Every second was a gamble. One stray bullet, one poorly timed movement, and the delicate thread of survival could snap. The remaining enemy fighters were retreating, but not without coordination. A small squad moved cautiously along the far ridge, likely attempting to regroup or secure a vantage point to finish the attack. Ross knew they couldn't risk exposing his men. They were battered, exhausted, and vulnerable. Hawk was their only protection. "Hawk," Ross hissed, urgency thick in his voice. "They're moving again. Small squad, West Ridge. Can you—" "Watch and wait," Hawk interrupted, voice calm but sharp. "They'll make a mistake. I'll take the shot." Ross's pulse quickened. He pressed Jenkins and Diaz flatter against the rocks. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, the creak of rocks, the shifting of dirt, the distant call of a soldier was amplified in the tense silence. The enemy was closing in, unaware that one lone man, wounded, perched on the cliff above, was ready to end the fight. And then it happened. A single rifle shot rang out, a whisper of death cutting through the canyon. One of the enemy soldiers froze mid-step, his eyes wide in disbelief before collapsing into the dust. Another followed, caught by the next precise shot. Chaos erupted among the remaining fighters. Rockets misfired, panic spread, and the squad disintegrated into frenzied, uncoordinated retreat. Hawk had claimed the ridge. Ross allowed himself a breath, realizing the impossible. One man, unseen and wounded, had turned the tide. The enemy was in full retreat, demoralized and disoriented. Survival was no longer a hope, it was a reality. But Hawk was still perched high above, blood streaked along his position, moving cautiously along the cliff edge. The danger was not over. Ross scanned the canyon, heart hammering, calculating the next move. The squad had to escape, and Hawk had to survive. Every second mattered. "Hawk," Ross whispered, voice tight with urgency, "we need to move. Can you cover us to the extraction point?" "Yes," came the calm reply. Move in zigzag, use the debris, don't expose yourselves, I'll cover every step. Ross signaled his men. Slowly, methodically, they moved across the canyon floor, using every boulder, every shadow, every fragment of debris as cover. Rockets screamed overhead, but Hawk's shots continued to control the enemy's movements, deflecting fire and forcing misfires. Each step was a calculated risk, but the squad followed perfectly, trusting the unseen guardian above. The extraction point, a narrow, rocky clearing near a cluster of surviving Humvees, was in sight. Ross's heart raced. They were almost there, but danger still lurked. Enemy fighters, desperate and unpredictable, still moved along the ridges, trying to flank or cut off their escape. "Hawk," Ross whispered again, "we're almost there. One more push." A faint crackle of static. "I see them. Follow the shadows. Watch the flash move fast." The squad surged forward, crawling and running in short bursts, diving behind rocks as explosions ripped the ground around them. The canyon floor shook, dust clouds billowed, and the stench of gunpowder and sweat was suffocating. Every heartbeat was a countdown. Then came the final moment of danger. An enemy fighter, hidden behind a jagged boulder near the extraction point, aimed a rocket launcher directly at the squad. Ross froze, recognizing the threat. Time seemed to stretch into infinity. A single shot cracked from above, a whisper of precision. The enemy soldier collapsed, the rocket launcher clattering uselessly across the rocks. Hawk had neutralized the final threat. The canyon erupted with silence, save for the distant echoes of fleeing fighters and the soft hiss of dust settling. Ross's legs trembled as he dragged his men into the clearing. Jenkins collapsed to the ground, sobbing with relief. Diaz slumped, clutching his bleeding leg but alive. Ross looked up toward the cliffs, searching for Hawk. The sniper's figure was faint, wounded but upright, giving a slight nod before retreating along a narrow ledge to safety. For a moment the canyon was quiet. Dust hung thick in the air. Rockets had stopped. Bullets no longer cracked. Survival against impossible odds had been achieved. Ross dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. His team gathered around him, battered, bloodied, but alive. One by one he checked each soldier, ensuring they were still breathing, still with him. "Hawk," Ross whispered into the radio, voice raw with emotion, "you saved us. You're a godsend." A faint chuckle came through the static. "Just doing my job, get to extraction, I'll follow shortly." And then the sound of rotors, a distant, yet unmistakable roar, echoed through the canyon. A helicopter appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as it descended toward the extraction point. Relief washed over Ross like a tidal wave. They were going home. The squad loaded into the chopper one by one, exhausted, battered, alive. Ross's eyes scanned the canyon one last time, searching for Hawk. The sniper emerged from the shadows, staggering slightly but determined, and Ross's heart swelled with gratitude. One man, against impossible odds, had rewritten the rules of survival. The helicopter lifted, dust swirling around them, engines roaring. Ross watched the canyon shrink below them, a landscape of chaos, death, and extraordinary courage. Hawk's figure disappeared into the shadows of the cliffs, unseen but unforgettable. As the helicopter soared into the sky, Ross allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. The squad had survived. The enemy had been defeated, and one man, a lone sniper named Hawk, had changed everything. The canyon would bear witness to the battle forever, dust, blood, and shattered rocks marking the story of survival. But Ross knew that the legend of Hawk would live far beyond the canyon, a story of courage, precision, and the difference a single, extraordinary individual could make. Ross exhaled, finally allowing the adrenaline to fade. "We made it," he whispered to his men. "We actually made it." And above the canyon, somewhere along the jagged cliffs, Hawk disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of a single, impossible shot that had changed everything.